This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed.
The weekly wrap is the week in news and what's coming up. I'm Claire Kimball.
And I'm Jodie Speers.
We're kicking off with what's happening in Gaza, a couple of big developments there this week. And in our other three stories to wrap up, there's a bit of a common theme.
Yeah, Trump's legal battle over his great big tariffs, the collapse of Healthscope and the Macrons scuffle.
Might not be obvious what the theme is there just by saying that, but we'll pull it all together for you. Also, some exciting judicial elections in Mexico, which is something I never thought that I would say. I'm feeling a bit fishy about potatoes as well.
Let's do it.
Our podcast today is brought to you by HubSpot. We all need a bit more breathing room in our workdays, and HubSpot gives it to you. Breeze, their built-in AI, takes care of the busy work so you can focus on growth.
Claire, Kate popped into our WhatsApp chat this week to ask why we hadn't plugged the Cool Sheet series at the top of the podcast yet. So this is us doing that.
Yes, we do what Kate asks us to do, or suggests, I should say. Her exact words were, "It's so good." So this week's episode was Dana Reid. She's a director who has just had her hand in so many iconic Australian TV moments. Huge career, including with The Handmaid's Tale. Auntie Donna, a comedy group, they come out next Wednesday. So they're really interesting because they're quite a thing, but also they're really big on YouTube, and YouTube is becoming more and more part of the conversation about entertainment. So they've got some really interesting insights there. Coming up after that, also, we've got Trent Dalton, which is pretty cool.
Love Trent Dalton. And Kate is correct, it is so good. Loved the interview with Dana Reid, who's also really funny. She was a comedian as well as being a director. We should mention, if you'd like to watch the interviews, you can. They're on our News Club Spotify feed, same place you find the weekly wrap, or over on our YouTube channel. There is a link to that in your episode notes. I think that's probably enough of a plug for Kate.
Kate, we've done that.
Tick.
The biggest story of the week, we thought it was really important to revisit the situation in Gaza, given there have been several big developments this week. We're going to start with the aid crisis that's unfolding there. I reckon if you've seen any news this week, chances are you've probably seen pictures of Gazans trying to get to aid.
Yeah, there's a bit to unpack with this. Israel had been blocking aid from entering Gaza since the beginning of March, when ceasefire talks with Hamas broke down. So that's 11 weeks where no food, fuel, medicines or other basic supplies were getting in.
Yeah, and this week some aid trucks were cleared by Israel to enter. We'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. The United Nations envoy to the Middle East said that the arrival of that aid was comparable to sending a lifeboat, and this is his quote, "After the ship has sunk, people are starving there."
Yeah, dire and really confronting situation. I've heard a couple of English and Australian medical personnel being interviewed this week, doctors and nurses who can report from the ground. They say that a lot of their patients in Gaza are children. They're suffering from the sort of wounds that you would expect in a war zone, burns, blast injuries. But they emphasise that these kids are so malnourished that they don't have the sort of nutrients in their bodies to be able to heal those wounds.
Yeah, their overall health is just so terribly bad. It's stories like those that have prompted some world leaders to take a stronger line against Israel over this aid situation. Last week, we saw the leaders of the United Kingdom, France, Canada. They issued a statement calling for Israel to stop its military offensive and start letting more aid into Gaza. They warned that they would take concrete action against the country if things didn't change quickly.
Yeah, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responded that those leaders were on the wrong side of justice and they were emboldening Hamas. Our PM, Anthony Albanese, wasn't a part of that joint statement with the UK, France and Canada. He said the Australian government would follow its own path. There are some within his party who would like stronger action though. Ed Husic, the former Labor frontbencher who is now on the back bench and a bit more free to express his opinions, he's been quite vocal. He wants his government to consider sanctions against Israel as well.
Yeah, and interesting to see too this week, former Labor foreign ministers Bob Carr and Gareth Evans also say that they backed sanctions. The thing about sanctions, though, with Israel is that our trade relationship with them isn't that deep, so any sanctions that we would impose wouldn't have any great sort of economic consequence. It'd be more symbolic than anything else.
Yeah, we're in a different position to some other countries. Others have been outspoken about the situation in Gaza. We even saw figures like Piers Morgan, who is a conservative, quite high-profile English media commentator, say that he had changed his mind significantly on Gaza in recent weeks. He had been somewhat sympathetic to the Israeli side, particularly after October 7, but he now says that the blockade and the ferocious bombardments have really crossed a line. He's demanding also for journalists to be allowed into that area to try and get to the truth.
And it is still tricky to get in there for journalists and for aid organisations, which brings us to how aid is being distributed in Gaza. Israel has stopped the United Nations and the aid agencies that have been operating there from going out and giving that food supplies, also medical supplies, water, all of those sorts of things. They've replaced them with an American private security contractor, which has only recently been registered. It's called Safe Reach Solutions.
It has links to the Israeli and the American governments. For its relief operation, it is funded by a new charity called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or the GHF. So if you see GHF in the news, then that's them. It plans to set up 4 distribution hubs in central and southern Gaza, but its aid efforts so far, you'd have to say, have been a disaster.
Yeah, and that's where we get to this week. Those pictures that we mentioned earlier are likely from one of its compounds in Rafah, which was overrun by thousands of desperate Palestinians this week. GHF's executive director also resigned pretty suddenly this week. So there has been that aid handing out disaster, as well as questions about who these people are and an investigation more broadly into the foundation.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see what the established aid agencies, some of them have been operating in Gaza for, a really long time, to see what they have said about this. They believe that they're the ones who have the experience and knowledge, and that that's really crucial, and that it doesn't work to just sort of set up this group that seems to have come in overnight and expect it to be able to operate as effectively in such a difficult mission.
Also concerns about these sort of big drop zones. The way they've been distributing aid is through a lot more, like 400, I think I read, sort of zones, but to only have a handful of big zones where you get thousands of people descending on one point and the danger that comes with that sort of event. That's certainly what we saw play out this week. The experts from the United Nations also say that humanitarian aid is meant to be neutral and impartial, but this new setup, they say, makes it a bargaining chip. Bushra Khalidi from Oxfam says, and this is his quote, "We are basically turning aid into a tool of control."
Yeah, the US is backing this new system though. They emphasise that it's not run by the Israeli Defence Force. The IDF is simply providing security, but there are those saying that the move could be linked to Israel trying to control more of what's happening inside Gaza. One more development worth noting, Claire, Israel's military says that it's killed Hamas's presumed leader in Gaza.
Yeah, so this is a man by the name of Mohammed Sinwar, otherwise known as the Shadow. His brother Yahya helped organise the October 7 attacks. We talked a bit last year actually about his death as well. That was quite a moment in that war before they went to a ceasefire. All of that reignited this war back in 2023. Of course, that 7 October attacks.
Those brothers are 2 of the estimated 54,000 people who have now been killed in this war. Most of them are civilians. Feels like the world is paying even closer attention to what's happening there at the moment, so it will be interesting to see what comes over the next few weeks.
Yeah, it sure will. A message now from HubSpot. Growing a business takes so much time and energy. That's what makes HubSpot so valuable for marketing, sales, and service teams. Breeze, their built-in AI, handles all those tasks that eat up your day. From following up with leads to creating content. Customers are cutting sales cycles in half and getting hours back each week. Check out hubspot.com/AI to learn more. 3 other stories from the week that we're wrapping up for you. I teased you at the start that there's a bit of a theme. I'm thinking it's about power dynamics.
And that's probably about Israel and Gaza too, really. That's sort of looped into that.
Yeah, that's very true. Stick with me. I'll explain it as we go through. So starting with US President Donald Trump's tariffs, it's been a real roller coaster week, and it sort of reminded me about the state of the coalition as well. It was off and then it's on again.
And we're all on this wild ride with them. We're talking here about Thursday's ruling from the US Court of International Trade. It held that Trump's tariff regime was illegal. It was described by some as the biggest political setback that the Trump administration has encountered so far since returning to the White House this year. And then on Friday morning, an appeals court said that the tariffs could remain in place pending an appeal hearing.
Yeah, quite a roller coaster, as you say. If Team Trump loses an appeal, they can take it to the Supreme Court. So there's still some way to go in all of this. Of course, the Supreme Court in the US is like the version of the High Court here in Australia. The reason it's such a setback isn't that it's just a big policy that was blocked. It's that the court's decision is actually about the limits of the president's power.
Yeah, I'm finding this really interesting at the moment. I'm a student of constitutional law at uni, and it's nice to see it applied. Just to explain that, like here in Australia, if the US government wants to change the way individuals or businesses are taxed, which is basically what a tariff is, it requires legislation. And the Trump administration imposed these tariffs using what's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and that was quite an unconventional approach.
It sure was, but of course imposing huge tariffs on imports on pretty much every country from around the world is pretty unconventional as well. So there were a bunch of businesses that challenged the move in court. For example, one was a wine importer saying it's going to put us out of business because it means that we'll have to put prices up and people just won't pay. So we'll go to the wall if these tariffs are allowed to stand. Also, 12 states, led by the Democrats, they moved to take legal action. It all sort of came together in this one decision. The decision was that Trump or any president doesn't have the power to impose these sort of sweeping, reciprocal, also retaliatory tariffs.
Yeah, Trump's top advisors have called this decision a judicial coup, and they have warned that if we lose this, then we will just find another way of getting it done.
Yep. Just it's very sort of typical, it seems, doesn't it, of what we're hearing from the Trump administration, that we will do what it is that we want to do. They're determined, it seems, to push the limits of presidential authority and power.
Yeah, moving on now, Claire, we're going to tackle Healthscope's financial woes because this is one that affects so many Australians.
Yeah, so just to talk about what's happening before we get to what it means, Healthscope is the country's second largest private hospital company. It has 39 facilities. It operates in every state and territory. It was bought by Brookfield Asset Management for $5.7 billion. Brookfield is a very big Canadian private equity firm. That happened in 2019.
And like so many stories, the pandemic has played a really big role here. You'll remember that there was that stop on elective surgeries during COVID for quite some time, and that really hurt Healthscope's revenue. Like so many industries as well affected by inflation over the last 5 years, the cost of delivering healthcare in Australia has become so much more expensive.
Yeah, so much more expensive, and Healthscope's revenue was unable to keep up with those costs increasing. So this week, the lenders who finance Brookfield's acquisition have called time and put it up for sale. In the interim, what's going to happen is that those hospitals will stay open.
And that's important because of how interwoven Healthscope is into our health system. For example, it operates the public hospital on Sydney's Northern Beaches. You and I were messaging with Kate this week about that because Kate actually had her baby Jack there a few weeks ago.
And this list goes on about how essential Healthscope is in our health system. In some parts of Victoria, the company provides the only mental health services for the government. In Darwin, Healthscope is the only privately run medical service, but from next week they won't operate maternity services, so there is no private maternity in Darwin.
Yeah, that's becoming a familiar story. From August, it will also close its private maternity services in Hobart. That leaves Tasmania, the whole state, with only one private operator. These services, public and private, have been far from perfect and have come in for quite a lot of criticism.
Yeah, absolutely. And Healthscope has been in the news in recent times for some particularly harrowing cases. The most recent one that made national headlines was the death of 2-year-old Joe Massa. There was a delay in treating him at the Northern Beaches Hospital. Healthscope said that there were unacceptable failings.
Heartbreaking story. The company apologised to this family, and to their credit, the New South Wales government has also responded with some of the family's requests in the wake of this. So even prior to Healthscope's collapse this week, there was major scrutiny of their operations and some really big questions about these private-public partnerships when it comes to healthcare.
Yeah, and that's the crux of the issue. The issue is that the public and private healthcare providers and hospitals work together so closely, and they need to for our health system to work. Our governments just can't afford to have all of the facilities to be publicly available, so they work very closely with the private sector to deliver services. Many people also want choice about how they get their healthcare.
I can sense a however coming though, Claire.
Yeah. However, there are very big questions about how appropriate it is to allow big international private equity firms to operate in this space because they are ruthlessly about profit.
Yeah, I've got a family member who's a nurse, and she really emphasised this, that when the multinational corporation came in to take over her unit, the whole focus changed from patient care to the bottom line, and it was really obvious. Just as another question that this raises, how do we make sure that the system is fit for purpose into the future? Because over the next 4 decades, the number of people aged 65 and older will double, and the number aged 85 and over is expected to triple.
I'm getting forever young, but yes, many others are getting older, it seems. And yeah, the pressure on our health services are only going to increase as a result of all of that. As for what comes next for Healthscope, they're now looking for buyers, and a new owner is expected to be announced sometime in August. We're just going to have to wait and see. So my power theme is these big companies have so much power, so it's just very interesting to see how that's put in check.
On to our next power topic. To bring us home, we're going to cover off a rather public shove to the face. We couldn't not mention this week. I'm talking, of course, about French President Emmanuel Macron and his wife Brigitte, and the video of their arrival in Vietnam.
We'll have to put a link, I guess, in the episode notes to that video. If you didn't see it, you'll probably want to have a look at it. But to describe it, she's largely obscured from view. Only her hands are visible on her husband's face. He appears startled, but quickly composes himself and then waves to the cameras.
It was strange, wasn't it? It was that particular moment when he could see that the cameras were on him, I think, that added to this. The Elysee Palace, Macron's team, initially claimed that this video was a deep fake. I think they realised then that wasn't going to wash. So then they said that it was a moment in which the president and his wife were unwinding by goofing about one last time before the start of this overseas trip. And Macron said it was just a squabble and they were joking about, as they do.
I saw an article, though, I think it was in one of the London tabloids, and they had a lip reader's take on what they were actually
the lip reader's take
to each other. So look, take this with a grain of salt, but certainly this is what the interpretation was. So after he was shoved, he waves to the cameras and he says to her, "Let's go." They take a step onto the stairs off the plane and he offers her his arm. She ignores it and says, "Stay away, you loser."
I need to know the French for that.
And then he says, "Let's try, please."
And she responds, "No." So that was enough to go viral globally. I had to check out the French newspapers when I saw this story because I'm a bit of a Francophile, Claire. I've studied in France a couple of times and I love the country but also find the culture quite different to ours. So I had a look at Le Monde, which is kind of like the Herald or the Guardian, that sort of equivalent. And I couldn't really find it certainly wasn't splashed across the website as you would expect with something like this. I found it. It was a very matter-of-fact story about Macron's explanation. But I was looking for the analysis and it wasn't there. The French newspapers also didn't even have this on their front page the next morning. So the reaction was the next thing that we needed to decipher. And I think the takeaway is that there remains this clear cultural divide between France and then the English-speaking world.
Yeah, and the Anglosphere got very focused very quickly on quite serious questions about respect and violence, and also this new examination of how the Macrons' relationship started in the first place. Of course, just to remind you, he was 15 and Brigitte was his 39-year-old theatre teacher when they met.
Yeah, pretty unusual start to a relationship. Just to explain the French media's reaction or lack thereof to this incident, French political journalists have long applied what's known as the bedroom rule to their coverage. So what happens in the bedroom stays in the bedroom. It's private and therefore it's not seen as newsworthy. We've seen some of these debates play out here as well, but it's slightly different over there.
Yeah, of course, this was on a plane rather than their bedroom. However, it's just about their relationship and they just don't go there. Fascinating to see how they dealt with this episode. So the French media just immediately accepted Macron's sort of this was just a squabble, we were goofing around explanation. It very quickly fell out of the headlines. But there has been some reflection of the younger journalists in France who are very keen to probe a little bit more around the private lives of public figures.
Yeah, and remember we talked a couple of weeks ago about the actor Gérard Depardieu and his conviction on sexual assault charges and what locals were saying that it meant for things like the Me Too movement, which is seen as being a little bit behind in France. Anyway, maybe some attitudes are changing.
Jodie, looking at what's coming up in the week ahead, Saturday is the A-League Grand Final. For the first time, it's an all-Melbourne showdown.
Sure will be. Melbourne Victory take on Melbourne City at Amy Park. That's at 7:40 p.m. local time.
It's a full house, sold out for the second year running. So clearly lots of soccer fans getting on board the A-League. Then on Sunday, this is the exciting Mexican judicial election we were
Give it
talking
to us.
about. So it's Monday, our time. Mexicans will vote to elect more than 2,600 judges and magistrates. It includes members of the Mexican Supreme Court as well.
When this came up in our production meeting this week, we all went, hang on a sec, kind of feels like this has disaster written all over it.
Because Mexico will become the first nation in the world to elect all of their judges. They won't have any who are just selected by politicians or by their peers or many other variations of that, all by public election. It's certainly what the critics are saying about it, that it's quite problematic. There are candidates without qualifications. There are some who are linked to drug cartels who have put their hand up. They may be elected. What could possibly go wrong? Certainly, you're supposed to meet some criteria, like having a law degree, but people who don't meet that have still managed to get on the ballot paper.
Curious. Those in favour say that it could help rid corruption and nepotism in the courts. For context on why this is happening, last year Morena, the governing party in Mexico, pushed through some constitutional changes.
Constitutional law, Jodie, here we go.
They did that to overhaul the court system, and that came after the Supreme Court blocked some of their big-ticket policies.
And what the president of Mexico at the time said, that's President López Obrador, he said that those court rulings were politically motivated. So how it'll work, 7,700 candidates are running for election. The winners are going to be determined by this popular vote.
Unlike political elections, candidates can't use private or public funding to campaign. It has to actually come from their own pocket, which is also interesting. We won't know the final outcome of that for a little while. There are so many to be elected. The official nationwide count occurs on the 15th of June.
So there you go. Who knew that judicial elections would be something that we'd get so interested in? But here we are. From one election to another, South Korea's presidential election is on Tuesday. Voters are deciding about replacing the impeached president, Yoon Suk-yeol. Of course, that's been such a big news story of the last few months.
Yeah, big one. He was removed from office after he placed the country under martial law for 6 hours, taking the world by surprise. That happened late last year.
We've talked about that a couple of times on Weekly Wrap. As for the big election issues in South Korea, Trump's tariffs. Of course, Korea is a nation that exports quite a bit to the United States, so their relationship with North Korea is always on the table, and the declining birth rate in South Korea.
Wednesday, quarterly national accounts from the ABS will be out. Claire, I can feel your excitement humming across the table.
National accounts are the ones that tell us what's happening with the economy, whether it's growing or not. So it is a big one. It's like sort of an economic report card. So the first one that the Albanese government will get post-election.
Definitely something the RBA will be keeping a close eye on when they make their next interest rate decision, along with the inflation data that came out this week.
Yep, headline inflation 2.4% in the year to April. It's pretty steady. It's a touch higher than they'd forecasted. The big news was the price of eggs.
Up almost 20% over the last 12 months. None of us will be too surprised who do the supermarket shopping.
Remember eggs in the election?
Yes. Not good.
Exactly.
That is due to supply shortages from the bird flu outbreak.
Exactly. Lots of issues there. So to round us out, MOFO, the festival will kick off in Hobart on Thursday. That's such a feature for that city.
Yeah, last year the festival was scaled back quite a lot because of rising costs. This year, though, it's back in full swing. That's thanks to a 3-year deal with the Tasmanian government that's worth about $7 million a year.
Yeah, the state government has done that because, of course, anything sort of attached to MoMA and MOFO and all of that great stuff that's come out of the people that produce all of that. It's such a tourism draw card.
Yeah, big time. Let's move on to our recommendations now. I am recommending a series on SBS. You can catch it on the on-demand app. It's called 4 Years Later, and it's an Australian-Indian series. Episodes are about half an hour each. There are, I think, about 8 of them. And it's about a couple in India who get married and they then have to spend all this time apart because the husband comes to Australia to do his medical training.
Right.
And so it's sort of a romance and a drama, and it's just really interesting. I haven't seen an Australian-Indian production like that before.
I'll watch that.
It came from a squizzer too, I should mention, my friend Danny, who said, please, can you recommend this on the squiz? And
fantastic
it's
recommendation.
Worth it, Danny. Thank you.
Yeah, well done. I'll definitely watch that. And again, you and I are on a joint ticket, half an hour episodes.
It just works. I can't sit down to 2 hours anymore. No movies.
It was International Potato Day on Friday. Squizzes know how potatoes are such a central part of my life. The reason to get up in the morning is a day that could, unfold with potatoes as part of it.
Who doesn't love a spud? I'm not sure about spuds with anchovies though. Talk us through that.
Yeah, so what I wanted to share is, and I can't believe I haven't done this before, but in my repertoire of cooking, I don't do it that often because it is quite indulgent. But if you're looking for sort of a potato gratin, beautifully sliced potatoes in a sort of creamy, oniony kind of sauce. The one that I do, and I don't even need the recipe for it these days because I've got it committed to memory because it doesn't have that many ingredients. It's exactly that, but it's a Swedish sort of inspired recipe. You put your sliced potatoes, some onion and anchovies that you've just sautéed, and the anchovies just melt. So it gives it that beautiful salty sort of flavour.
Right.
With cream, some breadcrumbs on top, bake in the oven, like incredible.
Okay, you're selling me now. I'm not huge on the big whole anchovies.
No,
but if
they
I can
melt into
hide
the
them,
onions. Yeah.
and they just add flavour, then
exactly.
That's good.
Yep, it's a winner. Sorry if it adds to your waistline. Squeeze press.
Not really, sorry.
We just want to say thank you so much for the survey responses. So we hit our target of getting close to 6,000 who responded to our survey. It's just incredible. And look, podcast listeners really came to the table as well. We got more than 1,000 of you, quite a few more actually, which gives us just such a great base to actually dive into what podcast listeners want.
Yeah.
It's so hard to get podcasters to do a survey. Squizzes are the best, so thank you so much if you did that for us.
Each and every one is appreciated.
That'll do for us this week. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next week.
See you then.
A final message from our partners at HubSpot. Breeze, their built-in AI, is changing how work gets done. It handles the busy work so you can get back to creative, strategic thinking. And couldn't we all use a bit more of that?